Hello, my name's Olu Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and today I'm continuing with my discussion on uh, the evolution of uh, chattel slavery from indentured servitude into chattel slavery during colonial America in the 13 colonies. Um, so I know I decided to start doing these videos to discuss specifically American presidents, but our American presidents grew up within an environment that shaped them, and so that's my purpose. So when I go into, I've been discussing Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers. Therefore, I've been given the backdrop of the environment they grew up in that shaped them, the way colonial America was, and I'm using the opportunity to discuss, to expound on the Declaration of Independence and the grievances that Thomas Jefferson raised. So as a historian, uh, the way to properly analyze and understand, the text, the reading of the Declaration of Independence, and every grievance that's cited is to go into the historical, background and look at the facts. And so that's what I'm trying to do. Uh, in the original, in fact, in his original declaration that he wrote, the original draft, which was struck off, not by Benjamin Franklin, was modified so as not to offend people from the Carolinas, delegates from the Carolinas. Thomas Jefferson had criticized slavery and blamed the British king, the British monarch, for the institution of slavery. And so if we go and to and of course, in response to the grievances, Jeremy Bentham, the great philosopher, the father of utilitarianism, who did a rebuttal, an unofficial rebuttal to the Declaration in his short review of the Declaration, and not just him, the person who wrote a 132-page rebuttal, his name's John Lind, and I'm going to look at his own rebuttal as well. He actually he itemized the 28 grievances, addressing, he itemized a counter argument for each of the 28 grievances, and he called the founding fathers delusional, right? So my purpose in going into history, how the environment of the colonies were, is to help understand, the text and the arguments, what's factual and what is, what is fiction. And that's why I'm going into the way slavery was organized, how it evolved from indentured servitude into slavery, by the way. And so that's what I'm going to be doing today. Um, I realize that many in America, there's a proverbial limited attention span of the average American today to be about 8 seconds. And I've been doing these videos at about an hour long, over 40 minutes, on average. And I realized, well, it probably will be a good discussion if I could shorten them to 15 to 20 minutes. I'm used to reading. I grew up reading. I still love reading. And so, but at the same time, I don't want to get lost in lose and have anybody get lost in these very hour long videos. So I'm going to break this discussion into several, and looking at the evolution of slavery, the evolution from indentured servitude into slavery. So I had done an earlier video in which I mentioned that some of the colonies, right, some of the 13 colonies were actually penal colonies, right? For instance, I mentioned Georgia, the state of Georgia. They were given a charter in 1732. The goals of the charter were for philanthropy, economics, and for defense, right, to defend against Florida, which was owned by Spain. And of course, the inhabitants, the indigents who were transported, were they were former convicts, but from debtors' prisons, right? That's in the state of Georgia. I know we don't advertise this in American history. Everybody talks about the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims went to Plymouth, colony went to Plymouth. That's in Massachusetts. That's where the Puritans were, right? There are other places where the Puritans didn't go to, and that includes Virginia and Maryland, the Chesapeake area, where also with the felons, the Felons Act of 1717, um, which which authorized the transportation of convicted criminals from England, from Britain, except Scotland, to the Chesapeake area, to Virginia and Maryland, right? So, in fact, by the time of the Declaration in 1775, 1776, about a quarter of the inhabitants of Maryland were convicted criminals, right, that had been transported. So what happened? So these convicted criminals from England were transported for the purpose of, settling the colonies, to settle the colonies and to work off their debts, work off their penalty, and of course, England was kicking out what it considered the undesirables. It wasn't just England. France was doing that as well in its colonies, such as Louisiana. I've done a video which I discussed that. Right now, I'm going to focus on the 13 colonies, on England's colonies. So England, of course, was growing, and it was much later on, towards at the time of the when it was industrialized. England was the first industrial nation in 1750, right? And so a feature of industrialization is that it has these large cities, and people were moving away from the rural area, from peasant work, from agricultural work, moving into the urban cities, and overcrowding was occurring, and was causing a lot of crime, right? And England didn't at that time, they didn't have the prison system, the carceral system that developed in America, and subsequently in Australia and other colonies as well. So the colonies was a place for these people for the convicted criminals to get a new start rather than execute them. The public executions were, they risked rioting and rebellion. And of course, there were those religious wars that England was always involved in, the wars between the Protestants and the Catholics, right? They were going on and on, even to the point that in 1649, the Puritans who won under Oliver Cromwell, they convicted and executed, beheaded their king, King Charles I. So these wars, they were constant in England, and so it was a way to also get rid of those who were perceived to be troublemakers, or other people who were adherents of a religion that England didn't want, like the Catholics. Like in the state of Maryland, it was created for Catholics, right? So that's Maryland, right, under Lord Baltimore, and it welcomed a lot of convicted criminals as well. So what happened to these convicted criminals? Uh, you know, uh, how come whites, because they were white indentured servants, how come they didn't continue as slaves? And, when we talk about reparations today, it's Black Americans that are asking for reparations, not the descendants of these formerly white indentured servants. So that's what I plan to do in these videos, in one or two videos or three. I'm going to break it down. Well, so this was how the transportation went. The there was there'd be a merchant, right? The Parliament authorized a merchant to ship the convicted criminals or the undesirables from England. And by the way, some people volunteered themselves to transport to go to England, like the poor, right? The poor were seeking a better life because they were poor in England. They risked just being executed, and maybe they committed petty crimes like stealing or selling stolen goods, which is called fencing. So some people, rather than just live a very cruel, harsh life in England, which was socially stratified. Remember, England had a stratified system. If you're born to the nobility, aristocracy, and you're lucky, you're all set. You're going to remain aristocrat. But if you're born into the peasant class, then that's your lot, right? No good for you, right? You have no, your future doesn't look good. It's bleak in England, right? It's bleak in Europe. So people were had the opportunity to self-deport, to self-exile, to go to America and seek a better opportunity. Right, the poor had an opportunity to go to the Americas, and often they didn't have money for the transportation. Right, so the merchant would bond. They used what was called a bonded system, and the merchant would take care of the transportation cost because it was, the voyage took like a month. It took a long time. It took several weeks, right? And it was very hazardous. It was a very dangerous journey, right? When I was reading about the times John Adams went to Europe on behalf of America to secure loans during the Revolutionary War, it was like a death, near death experience all the time. They were constantly they were all constantly escaping, death traps. In fact, the ships themselves, they were primitive, so they were like death traps themselves. So you were lucky to be able to make it, alive, through that voyage across the Atlantic from the Americas to England, or and vice versa. So the merchant would take care of the transportation, and so uh, it would, the parliament, the government would pay the merchant £3, right? They pay £3 for the transportation of of the uh, the convicted criminals or the undesirables, and this is not to cast aspersions, but we're going into history right now. And so when they landed, they were in the Chesapeake. They were taken to the Chesapeake market where they were sold at auction. So yes, there were whites who were sold as well at the beginning of the colonies. So they were sold at the auctions to be indentured servants, and the merchant could sell them for as much as £10. He was paid £3, sell each person for £10, and so he profited from the system, and so they were selling themselves off to be indentured servants, right? So, and the indentured to be the term of servitude would last typically from 4 to 7 years. So they would give free slave labor, free labor. So it's funny, free labor. Free labor in economics, when you say free labor, it's not actually free. That's just your ability to negotiate, right? In modern economics, when you say free labor, for instance, we operate a free labor system in America, meaning you're an employee at will, you're free to negotiate your pay, and you get paid. You're not giving, you're not a slave. So free labor is a phrase that's known in English as a contronym, right? It's a contronym, or what's called a Janus word. So it's a word that has two opposite meanings, just like sanction, right? Sanction means penalty. We understand that. That's what people normally understand sanctions to mean. When they say sanctions, the United Nations or organizational body or in government, you're expecting the main penalty. But sanction also means approval. So, so you have to look at the context. So free labor, yeah, free labor can mean a labor that's paid, like we have in the current market system. We operate a free labor system. You're paid, you have the right to freely negotiate your terms and to leave at will. That's free labor. At the same time, free labor also means slavery, right? Enslaved persons. So they were going to be offering their labor for free. They were so there's going to be a distinction regarding slavery, right? What's enslaved, the term of enslavement, all right? I'm going to get to it. But back then, these early white indentured servants, their labor was free. They weren't paid any money. They had a limited term period, right? And typically 4 to 7 years, it could be 8 years. Now, at the end of that term period, though, um, at the end of and the sort of work they did was typically agricultural work, farm work, because the colonies, especially Virginia, the Chesapeake area, Maryland, Virginia, were cultivating tobacco very successfully at that time, and so we're cultivating tobacco very successfully during that period. So that was typically what they were doing. Now, once they completed that period of servitude, indentured servitude, then they were given what was called freedom dues. Freedom dues was sort of a payment for the free services, free labor they had given over the years. It's paid by the owner, by the employer to the indentured servant, and he gives them some kind of reward. He gives them some money, some benefits to be able to start off on their own. For instance, and it could be an ox, a farm animal, an ox. It could, and then it could include clothing, uh, seeds, corn, to be able to start off, and a parcel of land, a small parcel of land, so that when the indentured servant, right, the white indentured servant had completed his period of servitude, of where he was basically free labor to the employer, then he could start off on his own, because it wasn't permanent. So he could get a gun. They'd give the white guy, they give him a gun, because so he could go off on his own, start a small parcel, have a small parcel of land, and some seeds, clothing, and just enough things, materials, provisions to be able to start off on his own and become a farmer, right? So that was freedom dues. Now, interestingly, this was a situation in the uh, in the early 17th century, prior to 1640, prior to 1650. Now, of course, the first documented Africans who claimed to the English colonies, right, of the Americas, arrived in 1619. It said they arrived at Jamestown in 1619. I've done a video explaining what the Jamestown colony, which was established in 1607. The charter was given by the King of England, James I, and to the Virginia Company of London. And the objective was to uh, seek profit, to engage in activities of profit, including looking for gold and silver. They were not successful in finding gold and silver in the eastern part of America, right? So that wasn't successful. So instead, they got to cultivate tobacco. So African slaves came over in 1619, and they also where their status was not as slaves yet; it was also as indentured servants. So they had the same status as the whites who had been transported as convicted criminals or undesirables who were exiled from England, right? Who faced a death penalty if they returned, right? So uh, the Africans had the same status. They were indentured servants. So the idea also was, just as I described earlier, that there was supposed to be a term limit. They would serve as indentured servants for a certain period of time, and once they were done, once their term had expired, they would they also would be given freedom dues. Now, here's a caveat. Um, Several caveats, in fact. First of all, the Africans who came did not volunteer. They were not convicted criminals. They were captives from West Africa, right, and Central Africa. They were captives who were transported via the transatlantic slave trade, which the Dutch West uh, India Company had started engaging in, and also English people like John Dawkins had started off. Many different people were engaging in the transatlantic slave trade. So I'm going to get into how that started as well. So they they were captives. They arrived in the English colonies through other means, and of course, Spain had also uh, had its colonies. They were the first to have their colonies, and Spain had already started the practice of slavery in a different way. But the English colonies were not yet practicing slavery. It was limited terms of indentured servitude. That's what they practiced, because for the most part, English colony had initially uh, been prevalent in the English colonies. That's the English common law as practiced in England, had initially been prevalent in the English colonies of the Americas, right? Because remember, these were English people. They were subjects of the English crown, English monarch, right? So they were English people. They were Scots people or Welsh people who were uh, who immigrated to the Americas. So they were still under English common law. Now, in England, let me clarify this. England didn't have slavery. The Queen of England, Elizabeth the First, in about 1574, she banned serfdom officially, even though it had stopped, the practice had stopped. So serfdom is the equivalent of slavery, right? It wasn't called slavery. Serfdom is the equivalent of slavery, right? The word slave, Slav, it has its origin from somewhere else, in etymology. I'm not going to get into that now, but anyway, for all intents and purposes, uh, um, serfdom, you can understand serfdom as equivalent to slavery, and that was banned in England, right, in 1574 by Queen Elizabeth I. However, even though it was banned, and anybody, in fact, if you were a black person and you were a captive, Africans who were held captives and landed in England, they were no longer slaves, right, at that time, right, and that there's a history record of Africans who were captives, and transported to England, but they were suddenly free, right? So they weren't slaves anymore because England banned slavery within its borders. But that is not to say the king did not encourage slavery in the American colonies. In fact, the Queen Elizabeth I herself, who banned slavery in England, serfdom in England, she encouraged the transatlantic slavery through a guy called John Dawkins, right? Sorry, John Hawkins. John Hawkins. He encouraged uh, the translat the involvement of British subjects in the transatlantic slave trade, which was capturing Africans from West Africa and Central Africa, mostly West Africa, and transporting them to the Americas. Right? Couldn't take them to England because slavery was banned, which is serfdom. It was banned in England. Right? However, she didn't stop it from taking root in the American colonies, right? Because the American colonies, they were allowed to, they were given freedom, right? They weren't interfered with by the crown, right? The crown gave them a charter. They started with a charter, and so they did things on their own. They created their own laws. They ran themselves. They governed themselves, in their own way. So but that's why they were really riled up when at the end of the 7 Year War between England and France, which bankrupted England, and England wanted to suddenly start micromanaging them and imposing taxes and things like that, because the English colonists had free reign. They'd self-govern themselves with limited interference from the crown, right? So this is why they were really so pissed with with King George III when he wanted to start imposing taxes and start micromanaging them directly, right? Because they're taking off away the freedom that they initially had under previous kings. So, but it wasn't England. So England was basically doing what they found that the what's going on in Spanish America, the colonies held by Spain. Okay, so um, Spain was already practicing slavery had already enslaved the indigenous people, right? That the conquistadors which they found in what's now known as Latin America, right? In South America, in Mexico, and all those places. But and this started and it was the Pope who authorized these practices. Now, in 1537, though, Pope Paul III would now ban the enslavement of indigenous peoples because the conquistadors were really decimated them, and so he banned the enslavement uh, of the indigenous people in 1537. That was the Pope. So the Pope was a very powerful authority figure back then. By the way, so the area known as Europe, just to help let you understand European history and how they designate themselves as Europeans, the area known as Europe, if you notice the landmass, it's not a continent on its own because it's geographically contiguous with Asia, right? And people wonder why is Europe called a distinct uh, continent when why why they how are they different from Asians when they it's a continuous landmass, geographic landmass with Asia. Well, the reason is because the area known as Europe was first circumscribed by Christendom, right? Those were the people who accepted Christianity, right, in the Dark Ages, and they abided by the principles and doctrines of Christianity, of Christ. So it was known as Christendom. That's what defined Europe, right? So you see, the Pope was very powerful at that time. So the Pope gave a number of encyclicals and papal bulls. That's just a law that affects everybody within his jurisdiction, within the Pope's jurisdiction, which was very wide. And so uh, there was one in 1452. It was called Dom Diversas Dom, right? It was so that was that authorized the transatlantic slave trade, the enslavement of Muslims, uh, and heathens, pagans, non-Christians from Africa, right, in 1452, right? It was called the Dom Diversas, and so it basically was authorizing the enslavement um, of non-Christians, and then there was another. It was followed up by another papal bull called Romanus Pontifex, which also was reinforcing the enslavement of non-Christians, and in this case, it was Africans, because the transatlantic slave trade was going on, and the Pope gave, authorized the rights of the King of Portugal, to engage in the transatlantic slave trade, and enslavement of Africans in the Spanish colonies, in the Spanish and Portugal. The King of Portugal was also the King of Spain, in those, that's the Iberian Peninsula, so in those Spanish colonies in the Americas. And so slavery was already occurring. It was going on in Florida. Florida was owned by the Spain. So subsequently, the English started to emulate what the Spanish colonies were doing. And so but again, in the beginning, in the English colonies, um, technically, uh, the enslavement of Africans, did not occur. It was they were Their status was as indentured servants. The difference between uh, the white indentured servants and the Africans was term limit, and this would happen later on. And it is said that the first known documented slave, was from about the 1640s, right? A guy called John John Punch, right? John Punch was an African-born slave. He was an indentured servant, right? He was an indentured servant, and there was a civil. Uh, uh, so John Punch. That was so. There was so there are two different cases actually. One, so John Castor was the first to be enslaved through a civil suit. So these were court cases, and that was what sort of started to legalize slavery of Africans. And then subsequently, the colonies started to pass laws codifying the enslavement of Africans. So in 1662, Virginia colony passed what was called the Partus Sequitur Ventrum law, which meant that uh, people took the status of their mother. So if their mother was an enslaved person, then the child was also an enslaved person. So that was what started to change and create chattel slavery. And of course, there were the Virginia slave codes of 1705, which defined chattel slavery, and they defined it on racial lines, right? And of course, even Maryland. So they started to pass these laws subsequently, which separated the indentured white servants from the Africans, and made uh, the servitude of Africans permanent, not just permanent, but also passing on to their children, right? And they started to stratify the colony on based on racial lines. I'm going to continue. This video is already 30 minutes, and I'm going to just talk about John Punch. Interestingly, John Punch is said to be, he's very significant. I'm talking about presidents through DNA analysis and historical documents. He's actually an ancestor of one of our presidents, number 44, the only Black American president, Barack Obama, through his mother, who was white, and Durham, right? So I've talked about how there are many people who in America, many white, white appearing people who actually can trace their ancestry to a black person. So yes, Barack Obama is said to be an 11th great grandson of John Punch, who is recorded as the first slave from a criminal suit, right? A criminal case. So John Punch had escaped, him and two others, white people, had escaped servitude as indentured servants. And while the white people were caught, one was a Dutchman, one was a Scotsman, they were caught, and their terms of servitude were just extended by 4 years. That was their punishment. But John Punch got life enslavement for the rest of his life. Prior to his enslavement in the 1630s, he'd married a white woman, right? He'd married a white woman. So the descendants of John Punch remained, and they became white people. So initially there was no anti-miscegenation laws until 1664, and the punishment for a black man who was no longer allowed to marry an English woman, that's a white woman, and the punishment for a white woman marrying a black man was enslavement, right? There was English law that said, white people, again, English people could not be held as slaves. So they abided by that, but the woman could be held as an indentured servant, and her descendants were indentured servants themselves for a period of 30 years. The difference between slavery and being an indentured servant is that slaves were held as slaves in perpetuity, right? There's no term limit. There's no end to their servitude, and it affects their children as well. And this was codified through the law of Partus Sequitur Ventrum, right, in 1662. And of course, there were other codes. There was the Virginia Slave Codes in 1705. I'll continue with this later on in a second video. My name is Olu Osha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.